Today we are going to be starting our chapter about language. Language use, as you can imagine, is really intimately connected to our cognition. Much of the information that we receive comes from spoken or written language. We can use language to ask questions, explain conclusions, clarify problems, and so on. And so, like our perception or our memory, language learning seems to be a really crucial cognitive ability. And I think it's really easy for us to overlook just how complex and important language is. It seems like it's very easy for us to take it for granted. So, continuing from our themes from earlier chapters, we're going to see that some language processes are bottom up or driven by incoming data, whereas others are top down or driven by the listener or the speaker's expectations. So some of our language processing appears automatic, so really just carried out without our awareness or intention. And then other language processing is something that we have to perform very intentionally and with a lot of effort. And so processing language is therefore really informed by the other cognitive processes that we've studied up to this point. So things like perception, attention, and memory in particular. At the same time, language is also used in other cognitive processes that are described in later chapters in your book. Things like thinking, planning, reasoning, making decisions. And so before we go and talk about language in more depth, it's really important to define language precisely so that we know what we're talking about when we say language, the term. And also we need to distinguish between the very related words of communication and language. And so although language is often used as a system of communication, there are other communication systems that don't actually form true languages, what we would consider to be a language. So many bees, for example, use these really elaborate dances, for lack of a better term, body movements, to tell other bees in their colony about a newfound source of food. And so even though this dance communicates where the food is, it only communicates that specific kind of message. So the dance isn't informing the bees about like an interesting sight along the way to the food source or something that happened earlier in the day. That specific dance is only communicating the location of a food source. Birds have songs and calls to communicate with other birds about territorial boundaries, just my tree, and also to attract mates. And so as humans, we have not only language, but we also communicate using other broader expressions, such as, it's called our body language, but it's really more communication. We also use body and hand gestures, facial expressions. Sometimes we use what are called paralinguistic sounds. So an example of this is, grunting in agreement with something. Somebody says, hey, do you, want to go to the DC? And you just go, then that would be an example of paralinguistic sounds used to communicate with others. And so I'm using these examples of communication systems to demonstrate that this broader term communication, it refers to the transmission of information from one individual to another in the form of these very, very specific messages. However, language can communicate a whole array of messages. And so in summary, I think the best way to sort of sum up this sort of distinction and relationship between communication and language is that all human languages are communication systems, but not all communication systems have the prerequisites to be classified as languages. So now we're going to move on and talk about what are these characteristics of language that we look for. And so a researcher by the name of Hockett referred to these qualities as universals. And these are assumed to be certain characteristics or qualities that are shared by all languages, regardless of their particular structure, cultural context, etc. And so the first of these universals is that it is regular. That is, it's governed by a system of rule, what we call grammar. And I just want to point out that our use of grammar here in the field of cognitive psychology, when we say grammar, we really mean a set of rules. We don't mean grammar as in grammar school and, you know, necessarily talking about, a preposition goes before a noun and things like that. We'll talk about that a little bit more, that's actually what we would refer to as syntax. But again, I just want to be clear that our more everyday use of grammar is not synonymous with cognitive psychology's definition of grammar and use of the word grammar. And so in addition to this grammatical system of rules, there's another universal, and that is that language is productive. And so this means that language allows us to create, produce, and generate new messages. We can convey a particular meaning that we have in a lot of different ways. And each of those ways are brand new to the person that we're talking to or communicating with. And furthermore, within this productivity is the fact that different people will choose different ways of expressing the same meaning. And the power of language is that it's based on this finite set of elements or components and a finite set of rules about how to put the components together, but we can create an infinite number of sounds, of elements of language from those rules. And so this quality has come to be referred to as infinite generativity. And it's something that emphasizes the novelty and creativity that's present in language, that's underlying this productivity universal in language. And so another universal is called semanticity. So that is the sounds that we make carry meaning in them. So the word dog, for example, refers to everything that we know about that particular animal. The sound dog has meaning to us. Arbitrariness is another universal, and this has to do with the lack of relationship between the sounds that we make and the meaning that's intended in those particular sounds. So if, for example, if a group of language users agreed to use another set of sounds to convey a particular meaning, that wouldn't necessarily change the nature of the meaning or the representation of that object, or whatever the case might be. So we can call an animal that has 4 legs and a tail and meows. Depending on our language, we can call it a cat or a chat in French, or a neko in Japanese, or even a thingamabob, if we all agreed to do that. And so there are a few exceptions to this quality of arbitrariness, at least in English, because there are some words that actually sound like the thing that's being labeled, like buzz or hum. And the word for this is onomatopoeia. That is that the sound that the word makes represents the concept that it represents. And so because there's no built-in connection between the symbols that we use and the things that they refer to, what we have to do is to learn language, we have to learn and remember these arbitrary connections. So in order for us to be able to use the word dog correctly, we have to make connections in our mind between the sound of the word dog and all of the varying concepts that come along with that. And so we, for example, English speakers or any group with a shared language, we all have to have the same set of these associations between the words that we say and the concepts or objects or ideas that they refer to. Otherwise, obviously, we wouldn't be able to communicate with each other very well. And so there are two qualities that come out of this arbitrariness universal. And these are flexibility and naming. And the idea with flexibility is that as time passes, language changes. And words that meant one thing in one culture or at one time may come to mean something else. So if the word was borrowed, we see this in a lot of English words that have French roots to them, for example. So some examples of this is that the word typewriter, it originally meant a person who used a machine to write. But now I doubt that any of that came to mind when I said the word typewriter. In fact, now we think of the actual machine itself as the typewriter, rather than the label assigned to the person who uses the typewriter. In addition, we may develop new words for the same object at different times. So there might be names for an object that change over time, such as just the abbreviation TV. It used to just consistently be called television. And then eventually it was shortened down, and now very frequently, much more frequently referred to as TV than television. What we call a car was once known as an automobile when it was first debuted, or even colloquially, a difficult word to say, and that is just sort of like an everyday speech. That's what colloquial means. People would refer to their car as their wheels. And so moving on to the second related quality is naming. And so with language, we can name anything that we see or hear or sense or what have you. So language allows us to assign labels to new experiences, to new inventions and objects. So for example, when a new product is created, we can make up a name to fit it. So we have things like microwaves, laptops, drones. We can also name intangibles, that is things that we aren't able to physically touch and see, like truth, justice, freedom. And so the last universal that we're going to talk about is displacement. And displacement is what allows us to talk and think about time outside of our own. That is, we can talk about the past and the future, and we can move out of the present. This also allows us to metaphorically go other places. So we can talk about things and people and events that are in different locations. And so by using verbs and different conjugations of verbs, so like run, running, ran, we are able to talk about the events that we anticipate or the things that happened in the past. So all of these characteristics of language or universals of language together are the sort of set of rules that define what is technically known as language. And so now that we have a better sense of what language is, let's talk about what language does. So language serves two functions. We have communication and representation. And so the function of communication, it allows the people who use language to convey information to others. There's this desire behind it to express our feelings or our ideas or our beliefs. And simply put, people want to communicate, and language allows them to do so in much more detailed and specific ways in comparison to something that's more broadly communicative in nature, such as hand gestures. And in addition, language also allows us to mentally represent objects, people, and events that might not be immediately present or available to us. And so because of the displacement universal that we just talked about, we can think about and talk about the hypothetical and the potential, as well as things that have happened in the past, and things like conversations we had or memories. So language was initially studied by linguists, but the linguists took a particular approach to the study of language, and they were really focused on the more formal structure of language and people's knowledge of that structure. So they were really just more focused on again, sort of more of what language was rather than what language does. And so in contrast, there were some psychologists who studied language, and they were really fascinated by the function of language and how people use language. And so as a result of this difference, eventually a new discipline came to be developed called psycholinguistics. So just to reiterate this distinction, the field of linguistics is primarily interested in competence. So that is what people know about language. Whereas psycholinguistics are people who are more interested in performance. They're more interested in how people use what they know. So now we're going to take a little bit more of a linguistics level lens as we discuss the structural dimensions of language. And so linguists identified three levels of language. So these are phonology, syntax, and semantics. And you'll notice on the slide this sort of hierarchical representation of the language levels that are proposed to exist. And just for the extent of our knowledge and application in cognition, we're only going to talk about the levels of phonology, syntax, and semantics. But of course, there are a number of other proposed structural dimensions of language as well. And so the combination of phonology, syntax, and semantics is called a grammar. And so again, this word grammar in the context of cognition means the entire set of rules that are needed to produce really comprehensible, coherent sentences and paragraphs. And so notice that the term, again, grammar is being used in regard to this idea of a set of rules. So the first level that we're going to talk about is phonology. And so this is the study of the sound system of language. And so it includes things like which sounds are acceptable sounds in a particular language, as well as the rules that are needed to combine those sounds. So for example, in English, we cannot begin a word with the sound till. However, we can end words in tul, like bottle. The same thing is true for the sound combination and g. Again, we can't start words with that combination, but we can end plenty of words with it. So besides this phonological sound system, we also have a word system, and this is syntax. And so this involves the classification of words by their function, such as nouns, verbs, adverbs, object, subject, etc., and also the words needed to combine all of the words into acceptable sentences. And finally, the semantic system is the meaning system. It includes the definitions or meanings of individual words, as well as the rules that are needed to combine them together to make meaningful sentences and paragraphs. So now we're going to go into each of these levels with a little bit more detail. And so starting with the phonological level, the first thing that we want to talk about is the fact that the smallest unit of speech is called a phone. And so a phone is the individual sound that is produced, or the individual sounds that are produced when we speak. And many of our words in English are spelled in such a way that two or more letters often stand for one phone. For example, a double E is a single long E sound. An N and a G together make a single sound, and an O and an A together make a long O sound, like in boat. And so there are, practically speaking, an infinite number of phones that can be produced by any given language speaker. And so the next level up from this is the phoneme. And these are the smallest sounds that people perceive as being different from each other. Interestingly enough, there are about 200 different phonemes that are present across all known spoken languages, but English only contains about 46. And any given phoneme is actually a group of phones that are perceived as being the same. So for instance, the k in cool or keep seems to be the same in English. In fact, the two k sounds are slightly different from each other in this instance. The k in keep is pronounced farther forward in the mouth, keep, whereas the k in cool is pronounced farther back in the mouth, almost in the throat. However, English speakers don't really make a distinction between these two different phones, however. We just perceive it as the k phoneme. And each phoneme in a language is a group of sounds that make a difference in meaning. And so for example, if we begin with the word ice, and then we add an l to the beginning, we have the word life. Then if we change the l to r, the word becomes rice. The L and the R change the meaning. And so each of them is considered a phoneme. In other languages, like we've said, the phonemes are different. So for example, in Japanese and in Tiv, which is a Nigerian language, there is no distinction between l and r. The words life and rice sound the same to Japanese and Tiv speakers. On a personal note, I'm half Japanese, and I was babysat very often by my Japanese grandma as a young kid. And so for a while, I really struggled with correctly pronouncing words that had hard R's in them because of how I had heard my grandma pronounce them. They sounded more like L's. And so moving on, some more examples about different phonemes in different languages. The two k sounds of keep and cool that I mentioned earlier are actually considered two different phonemes in Arabic, even though we would consider that k sound to be just one in English. So the k in keep is used in an Arabic word for dog, called. And when we use the k that is found in cool, however, the word becomes kolb, which means heart. And apologies to anybody who actually speaks Arabic. I clearly do not. So I'm sorry if I mispronounced either one of those words. And so anyway, besides the phonemes in language, we also have rules for combining these phonemes into actual words in language. And we all have these very extensive sets of knowledge about what the rules are and how exactly the phonemes can be combined in the language that we're speaking. This is something referred to as our phonemic competence. And typically, we aren't taught this information about how to go about properly combining phonemes based on the language that we're speaking. Rather, we acquire it really implicitly, and therefore it can be difficult for us to talk about on our own. And so because of this, linguists, they really tried to do research to make the rules that we use more explicit, more understandable. And so there seems to be from the lines of initial linguistic research that was done, three articulatory features. So features that are used to produce language that were really important. And so we're going to talk about these. They're the place of articulation, the manner of articulation, and voicing. And so the term place of articulation has to do with the location in the mouth and also the throat where a certain sound is produced. And so, for instance, a sound may be produced with both lips, in which case it is the very technical term for it would be bilabial, just meaning both lips are involved. So this is the case in the letter B, for example. You need both of your lips to come together to pronounce that sound. So the manner of articulation refers to how much airflow is obstructed when a sound is actually produced. And so a sound like the letter T is called a stop because the air is completely obstructed when you say T. In contrast, there are other terms that we use with letters based on the airflow. The letter S is called a fricative. There are also other sounds that tend to be more nasal, such as n. Then there are also letters that have little to no obstruction to them in terms of airflow, such as W or Y. And so finally, the term voicing has to do with the timing of airflow that's released in relationship to the vibration of our vocal cords. And so when the airflow release and the vibration of the vocal cords begin at about the same time, then it is considered a voice sound. And so what linguists were hoping to do was to connect these articulatory features to their physical functions in the body. And so to do this, they use what's called a spectrogram or a spectrograph analysis. And this is used to measure the acoustic features of speech. This is because a spectrogram can display signal strengths over time at various frequencies in a sound wave. And so in doing these spectrographic recordings, linguists found that there are three acoustic features of speech. So the first is frequency. So this is the pitch or the highness or the lowness of a sound. The next is the amplitude, that is essentially the volume, how loud it is. And then finally, there is phase, which is, to get really technical, you don't need to get as technical with this in your understanding of this, but phase is a measure of how well the beginning points of various wave cycles match up. Essentially, this is what translates to the quality of the sound. So for example, the phase of a flute is very different in the quality of sound in comparison to a pipe organ or a tuba. And so in addition to these acoustic qualities of speech, a number of problems were found when researchers really tried to tie together these the previous articulatory features that we talked about. So that is the place of articulation, manner of articulation, and voicing, to these three acoustic features of frequency, amplitude, and phase. And so the I lost my cursor. There it is. Okay, so the first issue that arose is that there's a great deal actually of variability in the way that phonemes sound depending on the context. So the way in which phonemes sound is actually dependent on how other sounds around them are produced as well. And so in addition, phonemes can sound very different depending on the person who's pronouncing them. So we have influences like dialect, gender, age, a person's proficiency and fluency in a particular language, and also attention. These are all things that produce really large variation in the sounds of phonemes. And this variability was big enough that the articulatory features, they weren't actually reflected in any consistent, distinct pattern in the spectrograms. So it wasn't the case that a certain pattern would correspond to a certain articulatory feature, which is definitely not what the linguists were thinking was going to be the case. In addition to this, there was also this phenomenon called parallel transmission or co-articulation that also showed up on the spectrogram. So that is, rather than phonemes being produced and transmitted individually, such as in the word cat, saying k, t, one after the other, they're actually produced in parallel, cat. You actually, in a way, say them all together. That is when you are a more fluent speaker of a language. And so this then makes context really important. In supporting this idea is evidence that when a word is removed from its context, people actually have a great deal of difficulty identifying the word. So there is this clever demonstration of this by researchers in 1964, Pollock and Pickett. So what they did was they took conversations, they recorded them, and then they took out individual words and then put the recording back together again, missing certain words. And then they played the individual words that they took out of those recordings to a group of participants and said, hey, can you tell me the word that you hear in this recording? And interestingly enough, they could identify the words accurately only 47% of the time. And so that is even less than chance levels. And again, this is going to show that context is really key when it comes to producing and understanding language. And so finally, linguists expected to find that there were spaces between words that would be the spaces that are heard between words as we're listening to a sentence. They thought that those would show up on the spectrogram. However, it turns out that most of the time we don't actually pause between words. even though, kind of in the way that we think about words, there are, all of these spaces between them. And so this is actually why when you hear a foreign language being spoken that you don't understand, or maybe you're just beginning to study, it sounds like just this one continuous stream of sound. It's really difficult to pick out individual words, let alone understand the overarching context and the rest of the conversation. And so these spectrograph analyses show that we actually pause more frequently in the middle of words than we do between words. So that is to say that airflow and vocal cord vibration is actually interrupted more frequently in the middle of words than previously thought. And so in summary then, the initial classification of the articulatory features of sounds of language didn't match the acoustic analyses. And so this shows us that phonemes are actually variable depending on the speaker and the context. Phonemes are produced in parallel rather than sequentially, and people don't actually pause between words, but rather they're more often pausing within words. And so since we do split up the speech stream into words very easily, that is, in languages that we're proficient in, what we hear isn't a constant stream of noise like we did when we were maybe first taking that Spanish class, but rather we eventually are able to split it up into words. And we can do this very easily. And this observation suggests that both top-down and bottom-up processes are operating. And so some evidence for this research was done by researchers named Warren and Warren in 1970. And so what they did was they constructed sentences where the beginning sound of a word was taken out, and a cough, the sound of a cough, was actually substituted instead. And so they were interested in how people would make sense of these sentences. They were wondering, did context play a role in what was heard when the phoneme was missing, so that a participant heard a word, or did they actually hear the cough? And so they found that top-down processing did actually play a role. And so the word stem where the phoneme was really obliterated by the cough, so to speak, and it was the same in all of the sentences. And so if bottom-up processes were what was taking place, then participants should have heard eel in all of the sentences. So they heard eel in all of the sentences. And so if it was only bottom up, they should have just been reporting eel. That's all I heard. However, what they heard was a word that was consistent with the context of the sentence that was being read to them. So they would say things such as wheel, heel, peel, meal, depending on the overarching meaning of the sentence. So now we're going to move on to talk about the syntactical level of language. And so partly because of this seeming mismatch between the acoustic and articulatory features of speech, research interest then shifted from the sound level to the word level. This is syntax. And syntax is the arrangement of words as elements in a sentence to show their relationship to one another. Again, we have a set of elements, that is words, that are combined according to a finite set of rules. And so in addition, at the syntactic level, we have classification of words into particular syntactic groups. So things like nouns, verbs, adjectives, and so on, depending on what part they play in sentences. And so more so than many languages, English really depends on word order to determine meaning. So we have rules for what groups of words can go where. So for example, Adjectives come before nouns in English, such as the red ball, and not after, as in the French or Spanish. And so it's actually because of this change in syntactical positioning that we are still able to understand the meaning of a sentence spoken by someone who might not be a native English speaker. And so the way that Yoda speaks, for example, from Star Wars, to us as English speakers, it seems backwards, right? Yoda is not arranging the words in his sentences according to the rules that govern our understanding of the relationship between those words. However, in other languages, Yoda might be following the sentence syntax structure very well. Actually, Japanese uses this essentially the same sort of sentence structure that Yoda does in terms of typically the subject and the maybe the main verb being towards the end of the sentence. And so again, there's this particular arrangement of words according to certain rules within a language. So the first attempts at creating a syntactical theory that really reflected people's understanding of language included what's called left to right grammar. And so this grammar was based on behavioristic assumptions. And again, this is applicable primarily to English, but really any language that reads left to right. There are some languages that read right to left, and so this then obviously wouldn't apply. And so, like I said, this grammar was based on behavioral assumptions. And so each word in a sentence was assumed to be both a response to the word that came before it, as well as a stimulus or a sort of a prompt for the next word. And so the idea here is that a person can predict which word is most likely to follow another according to the relative frequencies of words in the English language and how frequently certain words will follow one another. So then here, for any given word, the probability that it will follow the immediately preceding word or words in a sentence is actually determined by the frequency with which it usually follows that word. So the more frequently certain words are paired together, the higher probability that you can sort of guess, so to speak, what's going to come next. And so ultimately, the idea here is that people just record and remember the relative frequencies of words. And so one implication of these assumptions is that sentences, again, at least within English, I can only speak for English, is organized from left to right. And so when we read in this way, the assumption is that the words that we speak and also the words that we hear and we read are processed in this sort of more left to right sequential kind of order. And so really the idea here is that we process one word at a time. And so further, this theory doesn't require any what are called abstract unobservables. So that means that a person doesn't have to understand what's going on inside the speaker or the listener's head. So it's not about understanding what's going on in the person's head. It's more about understanding the relationships and the frequencies between words that then allows us to have a higher probability of predicting correctly what's going to come next, which then, of course, is a more efficient way of understanding. So when the linguists and psycholinguists began to test this, they found a number of problems. So first of all, it cannot account for what are called linguistic intuition. So for example, the sentences here on the slide, John is eager to please and John is easy to please, are very similar in their structure. If the question is asked, who is doing the pleasing in each sentence, we know very quickly and easily that depending on the sentence, the answer to the question differs. There's a different answer to the question of who is John eager to please. And the problem is that the left to right grammar actually doesn't have there's no straightforward way of identifying what it is about sentences that allow us to answer the question differently. So another problem is that sentences that are ungrammatical, non-grammatical sentences can be judged to be grammatical in left to right grammar. So the only thing that then dictates word combinations are these relative frequencies. And so it's because of this, again, this basis in frequencies, it's then possible to produce a sentence that has appropriate frequencies, but it doesn't make grammatical sense, such as their pool ran the rain to in shock. These are words that often would go together in some sort of combination, one or two words together. But based on probability, that's great, but this doesn't make sense. And so a third problem is that the left to right grammar can't account for the productivity universal of language. And if this was the case, if left to right grammar were to be the case, because it's based on relative frequency, someone would actually be limited in their creation of sentences. They would only be able to call on previously experienced words because of this emphasis on word frequency. Another issue that left to right grammar can't account for are errors that we make, such as these things called spoonerisms. And this is when people switch two letters or the first letters of two words around. So for example, you have hissed all my mystery lessons instead of you have missed all my history lessons. So the problem for left to right grammar is that these errors are often separated by a number of words. And so there's no way that the idea of relative frequencies can explain or even predict these errors. These errors are not sequential in nature. And so finally, if we only learned association between words and more of this sort of stimulus response chain, then it's estimated that just exponentially, it would take 10 to the 30th sentences to produce all sentences of 20 words or less. So it's crazy. Left to right grammar doesn't explain how humans are able to learn language in about 3 to 4 years. If you talk to a 4-year-old, they pretty much have a lot of the basics down. They understand the rules and the structure. They also understand the exceptions to the rules at most times. And so partly as a problem with the left to right grammar idea, a really famous linguist named Noam Chomsky, he suggested another theory called phrase structure grammar. And in this grammar, he hypothesized that language is actually hierarchical, and that when people try to understand language, they actually break down this hierarchy into its various components. And so in order to define and describe this understanding, Chomsky thought that this linguistic hierarchy involved a couple of different elements. So constituent symbols, so that is mental representation of the elements or aspects of sentences, things called phrase structure rules, which are specific rules that describe the relationships among elements, and then a set of what are called terminal elements, which are usually the words in the sentence themselves. So this idea of phrase structure grammar, it differed from the previously discussed left to right grammar in a number of important ways. And so first, under phrase structure grammar, it was assumed that the construction and the comprehension of a sentence involves this hierarchical organization. So second, there's the idea that there is a finite set of rules rather than an infinite set of rules. And then finally, it was assumed that the language user has to use some level of abstraction. So as a result of these differences, phrase structure grammar had a number of advantages over left to right grammar. So some of the pros were that phrase structure grammar, it could account for linguistic intuition. So different sentences have different components, and therefore they're diagrammed differently. They have different meanings. Additionally, it accounted better for the generativity and productivity of language. It could account for many routine speech errors, and how we go about acquiring language is more manageable. Again, because of this more finite set of elements and rules. So this phrase structure grammar, it was a good first step. It was a step in the right direction for sure, in terms of describing language. But, you know, of course, as with any theory, there are several problems with it as well. And so there are certain kinds of ambiguity that come up that phrase structure grammar can't explain. So for instance, the following sentence, visiting relatives can be a nuisance, has two possible meanings. That relatives who visit can be a nuisance. So that is, visiting relatives can be a nuisance. But also, it has the meaning that having to visit relatives can be a nuisance. But if we were to use phrase structure grammar's rules and its analysis of breaking down the different components of the sentence, it doesn't show the possibility for these two different meanings. And so, in other words, it's not ambiguous according to the rules of phrase structure grammar. If phrase structure grammar says, nope, look, I broke it down. This is sort of essentially a literal rendering of what this means. Whereas we know, right, that our language isn't just literal. It's often very open-ended. And so phrase structure grammar can't account for linguistic intuitions when it comes to relationships between sentences. So for example, we know that an idea stated in what's called the active voice, which means it is putting the subject, is giving agency to the subject. We know that active voice means the same thing as an idea stated in the passive voice. So active voice would be, the girl ate the spaghetti. So in this sentence, you are talking about the subject, the girl, she has agency, she is the focus of the sentence, and then the sentence goes on to talk about what she does to the object, the spaghetti. Whereas with passive voice, the object is the focus of the sentence. And so that would be, the spaghetti was eaten by the girl. So with phrase structure grammar, passive and active sentences that mean the same thing, so essentially sentences that are conveying this concept of, there's a girl, she ate spaghetti, will actually result in different analyses. So phrase structure grammar actually will see these as two different meanings. These sentences of the girl ate the spaghetti was eaten by the girl. Those will appear to have two different separate meanings rather than the one meaning that we know is there, that there's a girl and she ate spaghetti. And another critique is that phrase structure grammar, it still doesn't speak to how we efficiently acquire language. And so even though there are the sort of more finite rules, there's still too many rules that don't account for why we're able to so relatively quickly pick up language. So then Chomsky went back to the drawing board and he modified this phrase structure grammar theory to try to address some of these problems and critiques. And so this modified theory was called transformational grammar. And here the assumption is that the meaning of a sentence begins as an idea in what is assumed to be a deep structure in the mind. And then this deep structure is transformed into the sentence that is actually produced, which is called the surface structure. So this idea of there's the concept that begins mentally in this deep structure, and then when the sentence is produced, it has this surface structure to it. And then when the listener hears that surface structure, the comprehension process involves the transformation of that surface structure back into deep structure again. So this bidirectional movement from deep structure to surface structure as we go from generating thoughts and ideas and questions internally, mentally, and a transition to a different kind of structure when it is spoken. And so Chomsky hypothesized that we use some of the phrase structure rules that he described before in his theory. So he didn't abandon everything. And he also hypothesized that we use transformational rules as well in terms of how elements in a sentence can be arranged and rearranged. And so some examples of these transformational rules include substitution, in which one element is replaced by another, such as the following two sentences. The cat teased the dog. Its tail twitched. We're replacing the phrase the cat with it. Displacement is when one element is moved from one place to another. So such as the man put down the book and the man put the book down. And then deletion is, it's in the name right there. That's when an element is deleted. So for example, the sentence, I have my coat, you have your coat, can be shortened down to, based on this deletion rule, I have my coat, you have yours. And so these transformational rules help to account for intuitions about sentence relationships and also ambiguous sentences, going back to our girl in the spaghetti example, so this ambiguity that sometimes exists in sentences, that phrase structure grammar couldn't speak to. And in addition, it's even more parsimonious or simplified or streamlined. And so even though there are these three transformational rules and this idea of this back and forth between deep structure and surface structure, there are fewer rules and therefore it seems to better account for language acquisition. And so it's now accepted that the structure of language is hierarchical. So we've really moved away from this sort of left to right grammar idea and more into the idea that language is hierarchical, And we've also taken on this idea that we have to use abstract unobservables. So that is, we have to hypothesize about a sort of a set of rules, which are things that might not exist actually, in order to account for somebody's language behavior. So as we're trying to make sense of what people are saying, we're often trying to also determine what the rules are that are governing their way of speech. So now to talk about the semantic level of language. And so because of the dissatisfaction that grew out of some of the syntactical theories of language, researchers, they moved on to study the semantics of language. There's a student of Chomsky's, Fillmore, who became one of his biggest critics, actually. And in 1968, this student, Fillmore, published actually a series of articles in which he described a new approach that he came up with called case grammar. And so this idea of case grammar is similar to transformational grammar in that there's this idea of this reciprocity, or this, rather, I should say, this existence of this deep structure and this surface structure. But Fillmore argued that the rules that actually govern the transformation, that bidirectionality between deep and surface structures, that transformation was actually based on semantic relationships or meaningful relationships. And he called these meaningful relationships cases, hence the name case grammar. So the assumption here is that there's a small set of universal semantic relationships. So, for example, the relations among the parts of a preposition, so that is words like of, the, by, a subject, verbs, things like that, that these are actually semantic case roles. These are meaningful positions within this sentence. And so the advantage of this case grammar idea include the fact that it actually takes care of the problems of transformational grammar. And in addition, because of the stress on propositions, that is, these connecting words and sentences that give us a sense of the meaningful relationship between a word. So telling somebody that you are going to stop by the house, or using the words on or up or down, things like that, that there's been this ability to just bring and include more of the semantic memory models that we've been talking about in cognition. And so again, there is this emphasis on the meaning of the relationships that exist between words, and how that then influences the transmission of ideas from deep structure to then spoken, the surface structure of what's uttered, and vice versa. And so some evidence for this comes in the form of a study by researchers named Mitchell and Holmes. And so these researchers studied what are called garden path sentences. These are sentences whose structure is such that the readers are actually misled in the processing. So there are these sentences that aren't super clear and linear. And so they're called garden path sentences because figuratively, the reader or listener is led down the garden path. That is, they're wandering around. They're not taking the most direct route. So for example, the sentence, the groundsman chased the girl waving a stick in her hand, is somewhat confusing. Beginning with the phrase waving a stick, which is a prepositional phrase, we assign this phrase, waving the stick, to the phrase, the groundsman. And then when we get to the word her, we then realize, oh, this assessment is not correct. And so we have to go back and reprocess the sentence. The groundsman chased the girl waving a stick in her hand. So if we just change a word in the sentence, though, the processing becomes more straightforward. It becomes more of a linear sort of path. So we could change the sentence to, the groundsman noticed the girl waving a stick in her hand. And so in these two sentences, the only thing that is changed is the verb. So we went from the groundsman chased the girl waving a stick in her hand to the groundsman noticed the girl waving a stick in her hand. There's this change in the verb, and yet this small change, it really, really makes a difference in our comprehension. And so therefore, the verb, specifically its meaning in the context of the sentence, is really important and is crucial to how we comprehend the sentence. And so again, this is something that wouldn't be predicted or even easily accounted for with transformational grammar. However, it does lead to easy prediction according to case grammar. So again, with case grammar, if we were to rely on semantic cases, that is, if we were to rely on the meaningful relationship between words and phrases and ideas, then we identify the preposition of waving a stick as belonging to the groundsman at first. And so this is something that happens rapidly and automatically. However, the reconstruction of these more confusing sentences, it takes time and more of our cognitive resources because we aren't processing automatically the second time around when we go back to the sentence and try to figure out, wait, what's happening? And so the research also shows that when participants read these kinds of not as clear sentences, their eyes tend to stay longer on the later phrases. So as the latter part of the sentence, presumably part of the sentence at which they started wandering and feeling confused. And typically participants would spend about half a second longer when they encounter a word to them that signals that they've made an error. So again, there's this idea of we go about using semantic relationships to process and comprehend, and that this is often can be automatic until we get to something that throws us off, doesn't make sense, and then we have to use more intentional and attentional processes in order to figure out what went wrong and what was happening. So that's where we're going to end for today. We'll continue talking about language on Wednesday.